Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, UMT and Pluriversity, for organizing this very important forum session, a session that perhaps should have been organized 50 or 100 years ago, so that when people around the world gained their independence, it would actually have meant independence, not colonization under a new name. So, uh, but of course, we are all experiencing this world where we have been made to believe in certain things which are not necessarily true. In a sense, we are living outcomes of perhaps one of the most powerful magic tricks that was ever performed, where not the performance moved around the world. There were many performances at many parts of the world, and some of them still go on. And the key performance, I'll show it to you. I'll see if I can demonstrate it. Abracadabra, abracadabra, boom, 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 abracadabra, boom, boom. At the stroke of midnight, you are independent. Hooray! So, my contribution to this forum is reading extracts from a short story that I wrote called The Epic Folly. And today I'm actually really very excited also because we will be seeing for the first time some of this beautiful artwork that my friend Diala Ibrahim has been creating for The Epic Folly. And at the moment, we're still both working on it. Both the text and the artwork is in the pipeline. I'm also playing around with music, and we'll see how that goes. Uh, but yeah, we're still working on it. But eventually, we will publish it, and I'm sure you'll find out when we do this. Uh, but yeah, without any further ado, let me get straight into our reading for the day. On the tallest hill in all the great forest stood a cluster of houses, tall and magnificent. Their towers rose high, and their mirrors were polished so carefully that those who lived inside them could look and always see wisdom, nobility, necessity. Because of this, the creatures of the towers became known as the wise houses. Or rather, that is what they called themselves. From their hill, the wise houses kept maps of every valley, river, burrow, and nest. Their scrolls explained which creatures were civilized and which were troublesome. Whenever something went wrong, the wise houses were certain someone else had caused it. Then they held meetings. One morning, a great meeting was called. Advisors arrived carrying maps and expressions of enormous seriousness. At the center of the chamber, the old frog mouth of the tallest tower blinked slowly. This blink was well known. It meant something important was about to be said. "Creatures of the wise houses," the old frogmouth declared, "disturbing developments have been observed in the eastern valleys." A murmur spread through the chamber. The eastern valleys were very far away. Few among the wise houses had ever visited them, but they appeared frequently on maps, which everyone agreed was almost the same thing. "What kind of disturbance?" asked a wedge-tailed eagle. The old frogmouth spread his wings across a large map. "Unpredictable creatures," he said gravely. They refuse to behave according to our expectations. Gasps filled the rooms. The wise houses had worked very hard to ensure that every creature behaved as expected. And now some were behaving improperly. The wedged-tailed eagle recommended decisive action. The kookaburras recommended swift action. The kites recommended profitable action. Only one small voice rose from the back of the hall. A fairy wren lifted a hesitant wing. Perhaps, the fairy wren said quietly, we should first ask the creatures of the eastern valleys are upset. The hall fell silent. The old frogmouth turned his head slowly. My dear fairy wren, he said kindly, that would only complicate matters. The council nodded. After all, the wise houses had never maintained order by asking inconvenient questions. And so, after beautifully phrased speeches about peace, stability, and responsibility, the council reached a conclusion. The eastern valleys would need to be corrected. The wise houses celebrated their courageous decision to protect the world. Far below, some creatures were frightened. Some were angry. Some were simply tired. Creatures told that they were enemies were now beginning to notice something strange. The corrections of the wise houses seemed to cause most of the trouble. The wise houses believed they were beginning a story of wisdom. They did not realize they had just begun the epic folly. The campaign was new, the work behind it was not. For centuries, the wise houses had brought maps, rulers, and scrolls into the forest. First, they renamed things. Plains became territories, valleys became zones, rivers became boundaries, hills became jurisdictions. Creatures who had known the forest by story learned that it now had official names. Officials measured rivers that had never considered being measured, inspected burrows that had never applied for inspection, and carried documents explaining where each creature belonged. The wise houses drew straight, very neat lines across the forest, through rivers, grasslands, burrows, and swamps, between cousins and nests that had always shared the same trees. In the wetlands, a green tree frog sang across a thin red line. On one side was the Northern Wetland Administration. On the other, the Southern Wetland Administration. Her cousin lived just beyond the line. They still sang to each other every night. The water did not appear to recognize the borders. An old wombat received a form declaring that her family burrow was now in Territory 7. She read it slowly, then looked at the ground beneath her paws. The ground did not appear to have moved. A young kangaroo had learned that her people's movements were chaotic and improper. She studied the approved routes, but when the rains returned, her legs still followed the grass. Deep beneath the soil, a bilby worked quietly. The official maps showed nothing of the tunnels below, So the wise houses had concluded that nothing lived there. The bilby had read this in a report once. He found it very interesting. Eventually, the creatures met in a clearing and compared what they had been told. The wombat had been warned that kangaroos stole water. The kangaroo had been warned that wombats poisoned the soil. The green tree frog blinked. "I was told neither of you existed," he said. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the bilby laughed. A quiet laugh that traveled through the soil and up through the clearing. Soon the others laughed. The official did not. He wrote something in his report. The creatures had begun to compare notes. High upon their hills, reports arrived. Markers had disappeared. Creatures crossed borders without consulting maps. Documents returned unsigned. The old frogmouth blinked slowly. Another meeting was called. A wedge-tailed eagle demanded enforcement. A kookaburra demanded efficiency. A kite requested a more sustainable correction. The old frogmouth unfolded a beautiful map. Very neat, very precise, every line perfectly straight. "According to this map," he explained, "order has already been established." "But," said a kookaburra cautiously, "the creatures do not appear to be following it." The room grew uneasy. Maps were not accustomed to disagreement. At one point, the old frogmouth paused. "Where is the fairy wren who spoke at our last meeting?" The council searched the chamber. No one had noticed when the fairy wren left. No one had noticed that she had not returned. The wise houses prescribed more correction, more markers, more regulations, brighter lines. They had prepared for anger, protest, and disorder. Their scrolls contained procedures for such things. But the forest did something unexpected. The forest stopped. The wombat did not register her burrow. She placed the form beside her tunnel where the rain slowly softened the ink. The kangaroo memorized every approved route, then followed the grass when it moved. The green tree frog continued to sing across the border. No permit was requested. Beneath them, the bilby's tunnels crossed jurisdictions that the wise houses believed were separate. The soil did not object. When officials arrived, the creatures were very polite. They offered tea, listened, and asked questions. "Why Territory 7? "For administrative clarity." "Why these routes?" "For orderly movement." "Why divide the wetlands?" "For proper management." Then the creatures continued to live. The libraries held procedures for rebellion and conflict. But nowhere was there a procedure for creatures who listened politely and then followed rivers, winds, soil, and seasons. The forest had not declared war. It had simply refused to believe the maps. The conversations continued. One day, the green tree frog spoke to the bilby. "You live beneath the soil," she said. "What do you see there?" The bilby paused thoughtfully. I see the rivers before they appear. The green tree frog blinked. Rivers were usually noticed after they arrived. The forest had always spoken in many languages: wind, soil, rivers, movement, and roots. The wise houses had written scrolls about these things, but the scrolls had been written from very high towers. One evening, the wombat asked the kangaroo, "You move across the plains. How do you know where to go?" The kangaroo looked toward the horizon. "The wind tells us," she said. The wombat considered this. Burrows had a different relationship with the wind. At first, the conversations were awkward. The wombat spoke of land, the kangaroo spoke of movements, the frog of water, the bilby of deep earth. Sometimes they misunderstood or returned to old suspicions. But the conversations continued. Slowly, the wombat understood why the kangaroo moved. The kangaroo understood why the wetlands mattered. The green tree frog understood how soil carried water. The bilby began to understand the shape of the sky. The forest was beginning to remember itself. They realized the old maps described only the view from the towers. So the creatures began another kind of map, not with rulers or straight lines, but with stories, memory, and listening. As the old maps faded, the creatures understood that refusal alone could not build a new world. They gathered, not in towers or marble halls, but in clearings where the forest floor felt wide enough for listening. The wombat brought stories of soil and tunnels older than the borders. The kangaroo spoke of movement, seasons, and winds carrying rain from valley to valley. The green tree frog spoke of wetlands that expanded and retreated with the breathing of the earth. The bilby spoke of underground rivers and places where distant roots shared water. Their languages did not always match, but they continued listening. None understood the entire forest. Together, they understood more. The forest was not one system. It was many knowledges woven together. So the creatures began to ask new questions. Not who rules the world, but how do we care for it? Not who owns the rivers, but how do we listen to them? Not which creatures stand above the rest, but how do we remain in balance? There were no quick answers. The forest had been divided for a very long time. But the creatures had begun to speak, listen, and remember that it had always been a shared home. High upon the hill, the towers still stood. Their mirrors still shone, but the forest no longer waited for the towers to explain the world. The old maps became reminders not of how the world should be, but of what happens when one account mistakes itself for the world. The work would be slow. Paths and wetlands would still shift. Creatures would still disagree. But disagreements no longer required one voice to command all the others. It required the more difficult practice of staying in relation. Long after the meetings in the towers had ended, and the forest had begun to find its own voice again, a small fairy wren returned to the hill. Grass had begun to grow between the stones. The fairy wren walked through the silent towers. Dust rested on old scrolls. Maps hung along the walls, their borders bright and confident, their rivers straight and obedient, their territories perfectly arranged. Outside the window, the real forest moved. The rivers curved. The plains shifted with the wind. The wetlands shimmered in evening light. And somewhere below, wombats, kangaroos, green tree frogs, and bilbies were still speaking to each other. The fairy wren opened an old scroll. It explained in very careful language how the forest ought to behave. She read it politely, then she closed it again. From the highest balcony, she looked across the valleys. Smoke rose through the trees, paths moved between the clearings, voices carried through the air. The forest sounded alive. The fairy wren laughed softly, not unkindly, just a small laugh for the long journey the forest had taken. Imagine, she said to the wind, all that trouble simply to learn how to listen. Then she opened her wings. The towers were quiet now. They had done their work as reminders. The fairy wren rose into the sky and glided down towards the forest, where the conversations were still unfolding. And somewhere between roots and rivers, between memory and imagination, between the past and the world still being made, the story continued. The long story of the Epic Folly. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. I'm happy to take questions.